The characteristics of fascism. Anti-individualism. Directly connected to fascism's sense of unity, its totalitarianism, and its anti-liberalism and anti-democratic attitudes is fascism's inherent sense of anti-individualism. Individualism has two definitions that are rather separate from one another. According to the Oxford Dictionary, individualism is, quote, 1. The habit or principle of being independent and self-reliant. 1.1. Self-centered feeling or conduct, egoism. 2. A social theory favoring freedom of action for individuals over collective or state control. Unquote. It could be argued that fascists would support the idea contained in the first definition, particularly their desire to achieve economic autarky or self-sufficiency. This fascist desire for national self-reliance will be discussed at length in the next video. However, immediately one can see a distinction between their ideal of self-reliance and the ideal represented in the definition. The first definition is referring to the independence and self-reliance of individual men and women. This is in direct contradistinction to the fascist ideal of self-reliance or independence. As will be discussed, independence and self-reliance can only truly be applied to the nation-state, according to the fascists. The other two definitions of individualism are completely anathema to the fascist. The fascist would reject out of hand all of the writings of Russian-American novelist Ayn Rand. Throughout her works, Rand extols the virtues of individualism. The fascist would stand aghast at Rand's ideas, particularly when she wrote that, quote, individualism regards man, every man, as an independent sovereign entity who possesses an inalienable right to his own life, a right derived from his nature as a rational being, unquote. For the fascist, the idea of any human being sovereign is nonsensical. Only the state is sovereign. Only the nation, the people, the Volk, truly have rights. Indeed, it was foolish to speak of unalienable individual human rights. After all, quote, individual rights are only recognized insofar as they are implied in the rights of the state, unquote. One cannot have individual rights without first having a state, and an all-encompassing state at that. Mussolini wrote, quote, for fascism, the state is an absolute before which individuals and groups are relative, unquote. Alfredo Rocco echoed this statement, writing, quote, for fascism, society is the end, individual the means, and its whole life consists in using individuals as instruments for its social ends, unquote. Individuals on their own cannot be thought to have a personality of their own, let alone a culture or heritage. They are necessarily products of the nation that raised them. The nation had existed for centuries before the individual had been born, and the nation will exist for centuries after the individual has died. He was born into an already existing society. He enters into the historical stream at a particular time and soon thereafter departs from that stream. The nation remains. The individual's only historical and social purpose to the propagation of the nation. Perhaps one could describe individuals as cogs in the machine, but it may be more accurate to describe individuals as cells in the body of the nation, and thus the body of the state. As O'Brien, in Orwell's 1984, tells Winston Smith, quote, the weariness of the cell is the vigor of the organism. Do you die when you cut your fingernails? Unquote. When cells run amok, it is known as cancer. It must be cut out of the body to live. The fascists believed that atomistic individualism would invariably lead to societal disintegration. It was neither practical nor a desirable goal to attain. Rocco argued that individualism was anti-historical, quote, because it reduces social life to the existence of a single generation, unquote. A philosophy that rejected the historical development of nations would invariably lead to the destruction of those nations. The spirit of the people would be subverted and distorted and left prone to exploitation from outside forces. If the nation collapsed, necessarily that would lead to the state collapsing and the subsequent chaos that would follow. Rocco continues in his argument, explaining how fascism helped to foster organic communities with a sense of history. Quote, "The development of individuals in each generation, when coordinated and harmonized, conditions the development and prosperity of the entire social unit." Unquote. According to this view, individualism cannot develop prosperity nor social cohesion. Alfred Rosenberg explains, quote, "The individualistic doctrine which conceived the individual as possessed of substance independent of his community has shown itself non-viable." Unquote. According to the fascists, it is impossible for individuals to find meaning on their own. Individualism, according to the fascists, leaves people scurrying about to find meaning, an impossible goal without a community, let alone a nation or a state. Individualism leads to a mass of empty people standing aimlessly amongst the wreckage of society. Rocco writes, quote, "The inequalities brought about both by nature and by social organizations are so numerous and so serious that for the greater part, individuals abandoned to themselves not only would fail to attain happiness, but would also contribute to the perpetuation of their condition of misery and dejection." Unquote. Gottfried Feder was one of the earliest members of the Nazi Party. Indeed, it was one of his speeches that inspired Adolf Hitler to not only engage in politics, but to join the Nazi Party. Hitler himself admits to this in Mein Kampf. Not only did he help to form the Nazi Party, he also served as one of their representatives in the Reichstag. While there, he sat as a chairman of the Nazi Party's Economic Council. Later, he served as the state secretary of the German Ministry of Economics and the State Housing Commissioner. Feder very clearly echoed the sentiments of Rocco regarding the contention that individualism leads to dejected and unhappy people. According to Feder, the individual could only attain their true sense of self, fulfillment, and happiness through service to the state and to the Volk. Feder writes, quote, "Only in the service of the whole community, only as a useful and active member within the framework of the national community does the individual awake to the higher life." Unquote. Further, even if it was possible for any individual to find happiness on his own, such actions would nevertheless have ramifications on society as a whole. As a result, the state must take an active interest. For the fascists, this is yet another demonstration of one of individualism's inherent contradictions as a philosophy. Mario Palmieri was an influential Italian fascist thinker. In 1936, he published his book, The Philosophy of Fascism, a book that, according to Carl Cohen, was, quote, "a volume of considerable scope," unquote. In this book, Palmieri comments on this fact that any benefit experienced by the individual necessarily benefits society. Palmieri writes, quote, "There cannot be any joy or any pain experienced by one single individual, any good or any evil befallen to him, which shall not ultimately affect the welfare of the whole nation," unquote. For the fascist, it is pointless to speak of individual freedom outside the context of the state. As was discussed earlier, the fascists believed that true freedom could only be found within a nation-state. Furthermore, whatever freedom individuals did possess were strictly limited. As historian A. James Gregor notes, quote, "An individual could be free in his choice to follow a leader. These individual actions were variable expressions of a single soul he shared with the community. In choosing his leader, the Nordic individual chose to follow him because he saw in him his own true essence. A common soul spoke to and through the leader," unquote. In this way, one can see the totalitarian conception further. One could approximate it in this way. The leader is the state is the nation is the people. The leader is, by necessity, synonymous with the people, or the will of the people. Furthermore, As was discussed in an earlier video, fascism was the best way of obtaining and expressing freedom. True, holistic, organic, sustainable freedom could only be achieved through the fascist state. The atomistic idea of individualism necessarily will lead to selfishness and societal decay, which in turn will lead to a collapse of true freedom, according to the fascists. Rocco writes, quote, "We too believe that the oppression of individual personality can find no place in the modern state. Our concept of liberty is that the individual must be allowed to develop his personality on behalf of the state." Unquote. As has been discussed at length already, the Nazis were obsessed with race. For them, it was a key explanatory factor for historical development. Where Marx saw history progressing through class conflict, the Nazis believed that history progressed through racial conflict. Race was a key part of their particular version of the Hegelian dialectic. In this context, individualism was impossible because individuality cannot be separated from one's race. The Nazis had a concept of racial souls. The collective racial soul is what informed the soul of the individual. The Nazis could not be shaken from this belief and argue that individualism was nothing more than a fantasy. As A. James Gregor notes, quote, "National Socialist intellectuals dismissed as a transparent fiction the notion that individuals might be persons of substance independent of their community. The individual was but a single facet of a collective race soul." Unquote. Individualism was a phantom because race was an absolute. Another reason why fascists attacked individualism was the belief that it was an outgrowth of liberalism. As was demonstrated in the previous video, the fascists held no love whatsoever for anything related to liberalism. Rocco writes, repudiating liberal individualism, quote, "Fascism replaces, therefore, the old atomistic and mechanical state theory which was at the basis of the liberal and democratic doctrines with an organic and historic concept." Unquote. One aspect of fascism's opposition to liberal individualism is the contention that the idea misplaces the purpose of society and as a result undermines the role of both the nation and the state. Rocco writes, quote, "All of them consider the welfare and happiness of individuals to be the goal of society, itself considered as composed of individuals of the present generation." Unquote. In this sense, liberalism once again makes itself obsolete through its lack of understanding of history and its purpose. It decouples the individual from the flow of time. It makes the individual forget that he is merely a link in a long chain. Connected to this, the fascists oppose liberal individualism precisely because it opposes the totalitarian state. The night watchman state was the ideal for liberalism. But in a modern world, that is impossible. Giovanni Gentili writes, quote, "Liberal individualism makes the state a simple product of the will of individuals, failing to recognize its ethical substance and the fact that it is the effective reality of that community that each individual finds at his very core, the living roots of his personality and the source of his rights." Unquote. Connected to this, there was the widespread belief that liberalism had become outdated. The future belonged to the totalitarians. The world had grown too complex, the economies too intricate. They could not be left to the invisible hand. Liberalism and individualism were outmoded. Mussolini writes, quote, "Political doctrines pass, peoples remain. If the 19th century was the century of individual, liberalism means individualism, it may be expected that this one may be the century of collectivism and therefore the century of the state." Unquote. Through their actions and their policies, the fascists attempted to discredit and attack individualism at every turn. In Italy, a 1927 law, quote, "proclaimed that the nation was more important than the individual." Unquote. Besides mere pronouncements, every aspect of every person's life was to be strictly regimented by state regulation. This was discussed in previous videos, and in terms of the economic sphere will be discussed at length in another video.